Well, thank you, and I'd just like to give a shout out to Professor Zhu for acknowledging the importance of technology in improving the environment and resiliency. I'm going to talk about energy poverty, and most of what I'm going to say concerns the developing world, and this is a session about regional differences, and so that's why I'm doing it. But I want to acknowledge that energy poverty is a global phenomenon. There's a lot of energy poverty. I start again. It's not that bad. There's extensive energy poverty in the United States and in Europe, and it's a chronic problem, one that's addressed through social policy, mostly through redistributive means, mostly inadequate redistributive means, and it continues. With the COVID surge and its aftermath, and of course the war in Ukraine, energy poverty is dramatically more important this year than it has been in the recent past, and it will be worse this winter. And what I mean by energy poverty in this context is that people are unable to pay their energy bill. This used to be a subject that concerned just paying their heating bills at home, but it's one that obviously includes their ability to pay their electrical bills for other purposes, to access the internet, and especially in the United States, to drive their cars. And these are real problems, and I don't want to understate their importance. And I also don't know how to advance this. Okay. But there are solutions, and in addition to the redistributive means, people in advanced economies have the capacity to build strategic fuel reserves to mitigate shocks from supply. They have the ability to develop diversified energy sources, both sources of fuel as well as sources of electricity through regional trade, both within their borders and across borders. And of course, they have the ability to incentivize private investment with subsidies for strategic purposes, and I should add, to strengthen my own case, to support the ongoing development of technologies that allow people to access energy more reliably and less expensively, and with less carbon being emitted. I'm not that worried about the long-term impact on Europe, especially of the current situation. I guess my presumption is that it will be handled, and I see it being handled in various ways now already. Governments are having to stretch and borrow, but it's occurring. I'm much more worried about the situation in the developing, and here, advanced economies have obligations, and those obligations stem from the fact that there's no one else to really help in the developing world. And our redistributive means have to incorporate the developing world if they're going to catch up to us and establish their own resilient low-carbon energy systems. It's been recognized, of course, by the international community in the SDGs, and in particular in SDG 7, where among the three major objectives, one is to ensure access to modern energy to everyone by 2030. That's a tall order. And to make a long story short, the developed world has an obligation that's been referred to by many others today to supply both the financial wherewithal and expertise to help make that happen. SDG 7 is generally measured against its two primary access goals of establishing access to clean cooking for everyone in the world and establishing access to electricity to everyone in the world. And this is a graph prepared for the IEA that shows the situation over the last 20 years, beginning in 2020 through the current period. And this is the curve for clean cooking. You can see that not much has changed, really, between 2000 and now. It's gone down a little bit, but by and large, we haven't made very much progress at all in establishing access to clean cooking in total. Clearly, the yellow area is getting smaller than the orange area, or getting smaller faster than the orange area. The orange area, which is Africa, is actually increasing. It's partly a result of Africa's population increasing faster than people are gaining access to modern energy forms. It's also a consequence of deforestation, making it harder for people to access traditional sources of energy, especially wood. You can also see in the top of that graph that there's a small amount of there's a small number of people in other parts of the world as well, besides Asia, the yellow bar, and Africa, the green bar, who have this problem. So this is really quite disappointing. The solution that's in vogue today seems to be liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, the stuff we use in barbecues, which isn't produced by most developing countries and has to be imported and then given away or sold at subsidized prices. That's not a resilient solution to anything. And I think we have a lot more work to do in this area. One obvious possibility is to electrify people and provide enough electricity for them to adopt electric cooking, which is something that was certainly done in Europe and the United States. That hasn't happened, and the reason it hasn't happened is because the corresponding graph for electricity access shows that although there has been substantially more progress in eradicating electricity poverty around the world over that 20-year period, we haven't eliminated it. And as in the cooking case, in Africa, it continues to grow as the population grows faster than wires are extended from the existing grid. So this is an annoying story, a frustrating story because of this chronic problem in Africa, but it's also an encouraging story because of the rapid progress that's been made in Asia. And that progress has largely been in India, where over the last 2 or 3 governments, there really has been a concerted effort to electrify the 700 million people who, in 2000, were not electrified. A large fraction of those people, nearly 300 million, were electrified just in the last, the previous Modi administration. And it was done in a brute force way by extending the grid, expending large amounts of national resources, engaging the private sector, and getting on with it. India has the great advantage of having a large, complex economy, access to capital, and a substantial technical bench that enable it to do that. So what we're really left with is this African situation. And it's largely a rural situation where people simply do not have access to electricity. If we're going to end energy poverty, we have to solve that orange bar problem. Over the last couple of decades, a number of technologies have become available that are helpful, and they rely on solar becoming cheaper and more widely available, batteries becoming cheaper and more widely available, especially lithium-ion batteries. And they're now packaged up in small kits and sold either for cash or on time in forms like the one I'm showing here that might incorporate a couple of lights, a phone charger, a solar panel, a battery, and even a television in some cases, if you're willing to pay the big bucks. Some people can afford these, not everyone. And even at the 15%, even at the $15 price, that's true. But they can be helpful in very rural areas where the opportunity to connect to the grid is really minimal, and the cost of extending the grid into those areas is prohibitive in relation to the amount of revenue that would be obtained. You could argue that countries should cross-subsidize, as we do in advanced economies, and make it cheaper to obtain service in those rural areas by charging the people in the urban areas a little bit more. That works when you have a lot of people in urban areas and they're rich, as in America and Europe. It doesn't work in Africa. You don't. Another direction that's emerged is solar microgrids that make use of the same lower cost solar and battery systems, but aggregate those supplies into centralized systems and run wires throughout communities. That's a cheaper thing to do, a cheaper way to provide service than these standalone systems on the left. And it, again, in our very rural communities, a cheaper way to provide electricity than extending the grid into those communities. But it's still an expensive solution on a delivered kilowatt hour basis. And so we have an opportunity to supplement grid access in low access countries by using these technologies efficiently in situations where they provide a lower cost option. And I'll acknowledge that the option that they provide isn't of the same sort of quality or nature as real grid electricity, but it's better than nothing. You could ask, is it access or isn't it access? And I don't think I'd have a ready answer for you. Even to provide these sorts of technologies in a reasonable period of time, say by this 2030 deadline, requires governments to intervene and provide subsidies. Most governments in Africa don't have enough money to provide the level of subsidy that would be required to reach full access by 2030. And they have to borrow it. They borrow it from the World Bank, from the African Development Bank, from bilateral organizations, or they receive it in the form of grants. The amount of money that's available from those sorts of concessionary sources is quite limited. And so governments have to use those monies wisely in developing plans. On the left here, I'm showing a plan that includes all three technologies: grid extension, which shows up mostly as blue on this graph of Rwanda, microgrids that show up mostly as green, and standalone systems that show up as purple dots. That's a fully electrified Rwanda of the future at the least possible cost. And that was produced using a computer program developed by some former students of mine who now sell services to African countries to develop such plans. And I'll talk about them a little bit more in a moment. The use of those sorts of tools and the use of standalone and microgrid systems within an overall sort of hybrid electrification system is one of the principles of the so-called integrated distribution framework that colleagues and I developed for and with the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty, which is a Rockefeller Foundation sponsored group of eminent individuals, with the exception of myself, who are engaged in the energy sectors of developing countries and have opinions and good ideas and access to wonderful organizations that can influence the course of events. The IDF looked at the overall problem of electricity access and building on this idea of using technologies in rural areas smartly, developed four principles. And the first was that hybrid solutions should be used, but they should be used wisely, and meaning in the context of an optimal plan. Second, that access should be permanent and universal. You can't leave anyone behind in developing these plans. Widely understood that it creates social stresses that ultimately causes the plan to fail. And permanent in the sense that there must be not only a technology that readily admits the resupply of fuel or has a long lifetime and can be replenished from time to time, but also in the sense that there's a business model that ensures that, as with utilities in advanced economies, there is a provider of last resort that steps in if the entrepreneurs who sell these sorts of rural systems fail or lose interest or walk away or are incompetent. And so there's a business aspect to the provision of universal service. Finally, the overall sector has to be financially viable. And that means that the utility that runs the grid, that's also part of this system, along with the systems in rural areas that are sold by entrepreneurs, has to be financially viable. That doesn't mean that tariffs have to be raised to a point that ensures financial recovery for the utility, but rather that the combination of tariffs that the utility is able to charge its customers, plus subsidies from the government, are sufficient to cover those costs. If they're not, then the utility is a financial zombie, unable to maintain its system, unable to expand, and therefore unable to satisfy its customers, which perpetuates a cycle of financial failure. And that is the prevailing situation in the vast majority of African countries. There's only one utility on the continent currently that is profitable, and that is in Uganda. And finally, the Commission established that electrification has to be economically impactful. That's sort of part of this financial viability of the utility. But more than that, it's part of the ethical responsibility that countries bear in establishing universal access. It has to improve the quality of lives for people and provide opportunities for employment, education, improved health, and so on. So we envisage a partnership between governments, between private sector actors who are involved in building these systems, and the international community that has to provide concessional funding and expertise to get things done. Government clearly plays an important role and has obligations in this kind of arrangement. So here are a couple of unfortunate truths. The large shortfall in internationally provided concessionary funds, and we're talking about a shortfall of more than an order of magnitude, limits the ability of private companies to invest. They require these subsidies in order to be profitable, and they won't invest if they're not profitable. They can't invest if they're not profitable. And so the result of that is that many countries in Africa are literally unable to achieve the 2030 universal access goal. People are surprised by that, but it's actually impossible unless that concessionary funding is dramatically increased. So we're campaigning for that. Here's another dirty little secret. Rwanda doesn't like that map. You can see that at the bottom there, I say it's 52% grid extension, 32% solar kits, and 16% microgrids. And that's what this Western guy said was the right. The government of Rwanda said, how about 100% grid? We don't want no stinking standalone systems. We don't like microgrids. That's not real electricity. And I kind of agree. And it's an indication of the ambition of countries to be electrified and to have permanence and resilience. And so the objective really, in addition to using these off-grid systems in a very limited way, is to fix the utilities with better business models and training and expertise. Now I'm going to do a miracle in 3 minutes. So this was done in India. As I said, India electrified a very large number of people very quickly by extending the grid into rural areas. It explicitly decided not to make use of off-grid systems. That doesn't mean there aren't off-grid systems in India. But the government's plan was to do it all with grid, and they did it. They expanded generation at the same time. There's still problems with reliability of supply. Many of the grid extensions that were made were into rural areas that are frequented by elephants, for example. And for other reasons, lines need to be repaired and are very expensive to repair. Microgrids may be the solution in those areas. But for now, India has electrified itself with grid extension. Now, there's a fallacy that circulates sometimes in conferences when you talk about this kind of thing, that extension of service, the doubling of the number of people over 20 years with access to electricity in India will in some way contribute to climate change, an acceleration of climate change. We're generating all that electricity, people are consuming it. Well, they are consuming it, and they're consuming it increasingly, by the way, in air conditioning, as a very rapidly growing application. That's a result of them passing through economic thresholds, personal wealth reaching a point that enables them to consume electricity at a scale more familiar to people who live in advanced economies. And there has been an increase in emissions. However, we did a study at MIT looking at the evolution of electricity systems in developing countries and paid a lot of attention to India and the opportunity there for solar, wind, and battery storage. And India is an important case in that sense because it lacks ready access to domestic natural gas, which is the main tool that's used along with rapid turbines in the United States and most of Europe for mitigating the intermittency of renewable power. So India really has this problem. They've got to do that. They've got to manage that intermittency using batteries. And we took very conservative ideas about what those batteries might look like. In fact, even assumed they were lithium-ion batteries. What we determined was that although we anticipate something like a 5% growth rate in electricity consumption between now and the middle of the century, because wind and solar plus batteries are cheaper there and becoming cheaper there day by day, the Indian system will actually decarbonize naturally without a carbon price because of high competitive cost of fossil fuel over that period. And so this is my object proof that the fall in Indian emissions from the power sector between now and the middle of the century by 25% is a sign of what can be done in other developing countries with these technologies. And as the map shows, many countries with low access have excellent solar and wind resources. There's a catch. This doesn't mean that Indian emissions are going to rapidly decline. It means that Indian emissions from the power sector are going to decline, or at least not grow as much as we thought they might. We were worried about 400%. And that's because Indian industry will remain highly carbonized, as it will in the United States and Europe, because we still don't really know how to economically produce steel, cement, ethylene, and other big producers of CO2. So this is an outstanding problem. So let me just quickly wrap up. I'm showing here in the lower right my 4 recommendations, which are included in my written submission. But the basic message is at the top. We have the tools. We have the social tools, the political tools, the financial tools, certainly the technological tools to end energy poverty globally right now. But we're not generous enough. We need a massive increase in international concessionary funding for this project, and it has to happen soon. The other part of the message is we need to work a lot harder on cooking, and perhaps grid electrification will partly solve that problem. And we need to work on industrial decarbonization, and we are. And I'm actually fairly optimistic about finding low-carbon electrified approaches to many of these difficult to decarbonize industrial processes. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.